built monuments, they commanded armies, they reshaped continents. But here's what history textbooks don't tell you. Some of history's most powerful rulers died in ways so utterly ordinary, so pathetically mundane, deaths became the ultimate insult to their own legacies. Not in battle, not by assassination, not by execution, by something far more humiliating, the random, indifferent hand of fate that treats emperors and peasants with the same cruel indifference. Is the hidden horror of absolute power. The more you control, the more vulnerable you become to the things you never saw coming. Invisible architects of your downfall aren't your enemies. They're the universe itself, working through the most embarrassing, undignified vectors possible. Today, we're exploring a question that should terrify anyone who's ever wanted power. What happens when the greatest rulers in history are defeated not by worthy opponents, but by their own bodies, their own carelessness, brutal randomness of a single moment? We're not talking about embarrassing deaths like sitting on nails or dying mid-sneeze. Those are comedic punchlines. No, we're talking about something darker, the systematic, almost poetic way that history punishes hubris through the most pathetically ordinary circumstances. King who conquered nations dies because he sat too long. An emperor who commanded millions falls down a single flight of stairs. Tyrant who demanded immortal fame suffocates on his own blood in a bathroom stall, alone and unobserved. The real horror isn't the death itself, it's what the death represents. It's the cosmic joke embedded in every crown. You can control your kingdom, but you cannot control your bowels. Can command legions, but you cannot command your heart to keep beating at the exact pace it's supposed to. You can demand fear from billions, you cannot demand that a single step won't betray you. Let me introduce you to the rulers whose deaths revealed this ultimate truth and in doing, completely rewrote how we should understand power itself. The first and perhaps most unsettling case involves King Adolf Frederick I of Sweden. Wasn't some forgotten minor monarch. Frederick was a legitimate European power broker in the 18th century. He commanded resources, orchestrated diplomatic maneuvers, and controlled the fate of thousands. But in the winter of 1771, King Frederick committed a sin that no amount of power could protect him from. He had an exceptionally large meal. Details are almost too bizarre to be true, yet they come from multiple historical sources. Frederick attended a banquet, nothing unusual for royalty, but he consumed an unimaginable quantity of food. Lobster, caviar, sour milk, a substance that historical records describe only as a Russian dessert of such richness that its composition remains unclear. The exact amount wasn't recorded, but contemporary accounts suggest it was the kind of meal that would make a modern nutritionist weep. What happened next was neither quick nor dignified. Frederick returned to his chambers that evening, complaining of severe discomfort. Within hours, symptoms escalated into something genuinely horrifying. His digestive system essentially shut down. His body, faced with an impossible task, simply refused to process what had been forced into it. Modern physicians believe he likely suffered acute gastroenteritis combined with possible aspiration, his own body essentially turning against him as his consumption exceeded every biological limit. King who could command nations could not command his own stomach. A man who held absolute power over life and death in his kingdom died alone. Agony, his body rejecting the very abundance that was supposed to represent his authority. The mortifying irony wasn't lost on anyone at court. Frederick had literally eaten himself to death, not dramatically, not courageously, but pathetically, privately, and completely unavoidably. Frederick's story is only the beginning, because the pattern of humiliation didn't stop with one Swedish king. It repeated again and again across centuries and continents, suggesting something almost supernatural in how the universe punishes those who believe themselves untouchable. Decades later, in a completely different corner of Europe, another ruler faced a remarkably similar fate. George II of Great Britain, another legitimate major power broker, another man accustomed to absolute obedience, died in what might be the most embarrassing way possible for someone who controlled an empire. On June 25, 1760, King George II rose from his bed in the morning like any other day. He was 76 years old, still actively ruling, still commanding the most powerful empire on earth. By all accounts, it seemed like an ordinary morning. King went to his bathroom. Then suddenly and without warning, King George II collapsed. Initial reports suggested he'd suffered a heart attack or stroke, but the actual cause, emerged in private accounts that were deliberately suppressed at the time, was far more mundane and therefore far more horrifying. King had suffered an acute intestinal rupture, possibly triggered by straining during a bowel movement. A man who had controlled the British Empire for over 30 years died on or near a toilet, alone, save for his attendants, death as undignified as any paupers. The court worked desperately to control the narrative. Official announcements spoke vaguely of illness and sudden collapse, but everyone at court knew the truth. The man who had commanded global military dominance died in the one place every human must eventually visit, helpless by the most fundamental and inescapable biological process. No crown mattered there. No army could defend him. His power, final moment, was completely irrelevant. What's truly disturbing about these two cases, and countless others like them, is that they weren't anomalies, they were patterns. The historical record becomes almost comically filled with stories of powerful rulers whose grand narratives ended in the most humiliating ways possible, as if the universe itself had a dark sense of humour about celebrity and dominion. Consider the case of King John of England, one of history's most notoriously incompetent and cruel monarchs. A man who created Magna Carta not through enlightenment, but through sheer incompetence and desperation. John spent his final days afflicted with what historians delicately describe as a flux, in modern terms, catastrophic diarrhea. He died in 1216, not in battle against his enemies, not deposed in a dramatic coup, but wasting away in a castle while his body simply shut down from within. Goes on. King Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs and one of history's most tragically inbred monarchs, died of what modern physicians believe was a massive gastrointestinal hemorrhage, his body's genetic deformities finally catching up with centuries of royal breeding. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who unified China and created the Terracotta Army, likely died from mercury poisoning caused by his own desperate attempts to achieve immortality through consuming mercury compounds. A man who wanted to live forever was, in the end, killed by his obsession with immortality itself. There's the case that almost defies belief in its stupidity. Emperor Basil I of the Byzantine Empire, a man of genuine military and administrative genius, died after a hunting accident that he caused entirely to himself. While hunting deer, somehow became entangled in the deer's antlers. In the struggle, he was gored repeatedly before falling from his horse. A warrior emperor, brought down not by an enemy warrior, but by his own incompetence with wildlife. Deaths all share a specific characteristic that distinguishes them from the kind of embarrassing deaths we typically laugh about in popular media. This isn't about someone dying while on the toilet or choking on food. These are powerful people, genuinely brilliant administrators, military geniuses, and empire builders, who were defeated by circumstances so utterly ordinary that their power proved completely useless. Deeper psychological horror here is that power doesn't actually protect you from anything. In fact, it might make you more vulnerable. Tyrants and kings often lived in isolation, surrounded by yes-men, denied the kind of honest feedback that might have kept them alive. Ate immoderately because no one dared tell them no. They refused medical advice because they believed themselves invincible. Engaged in dangerous activities because they couldn't imagine consequences applying to them. The universe, it seems, has a particular contempt for those who believe themselves exceptional. Not because of any cosmic justice or divine punishment. The universe is different to morality, because power creates isolation, and isolation creates blindness. The more control you have, the less truthful information reaches you. The more authority you wield, the less anyone dares to contradict you. The more you believe yourself safe, the more dangerously you live. This pattern repeats so consistently throughout history that it becomes almost a universal law. The most successful tyrants often outlive their more conscientious predecessors, not because tyranny is safer, because they're so thoroughly convinced of their invulnerability that they're willing to take risks ordinary people would never consider. Eventually, those risks catch up with them in the most pedestrian ways imaginable. But there's another dimension to this story that makes it even more unsettling. The very people who recorded these deaths often deliberately obscured them. Court historians edited records. Official accounts were sanitized. Embarrassing details were buried in footnotes or removed entirely. Because if people knew that kings died on toilets, emperors died of their own stupidity, that the most powerful people in the world were as vulnerable to random biological failure as anyone else, the entire justification for absolute rule would collapse. Power throughout history has always depended on mystique. The idea that rulers are somehow different, somehow more protected by fate or divinity or superior breeding. The peasantry understood that their king could choke to death on bad seafood, that their emperor could fall downstairs like anyone else. Power offers no protection from the fundamental indignity of being human. The entire social order might come crashing down, which is why the most carefully constructed lie in history is not the lie about what rulers did, but the lie about how they ended. Deaths themselves are accurate, recorded in medical documents and eyewitness accounts. The narrative surrounding those deaths, the meaning assigned to them, the lessons extracted from them, has been carefully altered to preserve the dignity of those in power. King Frederick I of Sweden, official accounts simply said he fell gravely ill after dining. No specifics. King George II suffered a sudden collapse of unknown cause. Actual details, the pathetic reality of how these men actually died, were confined to private letters and medical records that weren't made public until centuries later. And this pattern of concealment reveals something truly dark about power and history. Those in charge don't just want to rule over you, they want to control the narrative about what their rule means, want to maintain the illusion that power is somehow transcendent, that those who wield it are fundamentally different from ordinary people. The worst thing that could happen, from their perspective, isn't military defeat or assassination. It's being exposed as ordinary, being revealed as vulnerable. It's dying in a way that proves power is ultimately meaningless. Which brings us to the final, most unsettling question this pattern raises. How many of history's most powerful figures died in ordinary, embarrassing ways that we'll never know about? How many rulers' true deaths are lost to history, deliberately suppressed or accidentally destroyed? How many empires were actually undermined not by military defeat, but by the sudden stupid death of a single leader at an inopportune moment? We'll never know, and that absence of knowledge might be the most revealing fact of all. But here's what we do know. Rulers who survived long enough to be remembered, who managed to avoid ridiculous deaths, often face something far worse than embarrassment, face the slow, methodical dissolution of their own minds and bodies while still clinging to power. Take King George III of England. For decades, treated as a symbol of stability and reason, the enlightened monarch presiding over a rational empire. But behind closed doors, was slowly going mad. His handlers kept it hidden from the public, drugging him, isolating him, forcing him to appear in public, despite his complete mental deterioration. When the madness became undeniable, they locked him away in a palace, technically king, but reduced to screaming at walls and smearing his own waste across the room. The worst part? His handlers couldn't decide if he was actually insane or just socially inconvenient. They experimented on him. They fed him mercury. They used electricity on his body. They treated him like a malfunctioning machine that needed to be repaired rather than a human being suffering. Through it all, he remained legally king. This pattern repeats across history with terrifying consistency. Powerful people don't actually want to die in bed, surrounded by mourning courtiers. Want to be erased from the narrative entirely if possible, or at least transformed into myths that are more flattering than the truth. Consider the Roman Emperor Caligula. For nearly 2,000 years, his name has meant psychotic tyrant. He was supposedly insane, sexually depraved, and a danger to everyone around him. But modern historians have started asking, how much of that is actually true? How much is propaganda created by the people who murdered him? See, Caligula was assassinated by senators who were afraid of losing their power, prestige. Those same senators then spent the next 2,000 years writing the history books, portrayed him as a monster to justify his murder and cement their own place as righteous men who had rid Rome of a tyrant. The actual evidence? Much less clear. He might have been eccentric, he might have been a difficult boss, but a raving lunatic? Maybe not. That's the real horror hiding beneath all these embarrassing royal deaths. Not the deaths themselves, but what comes after. Survivors get to tell the story. The victors write the history. And if you die in a way that's stupid or undignified or politically inconvenient, people with power can simply erase the truth and replace it with whatever version serves them best. This is why the deaths we do know about are so valuable from a historical perspective. When a ruler's death is stupid enough that it can't be fully covered up, when multiple independent sources report basically the same embarrassing fact, we get a rare glimpse of reality breaking through the propaganda. King Henry II of France died from a jousting accident in 1559, was hit in the eye with a lance during a friendly competition, but that basic fact, a king dying from a stupid sporting injury, couldn't be suppressed because too many people saw it happen. The entire court was watching. Nobles from multiple countries witnessed it. There was no way to claim he died of noble causes or divine will when the evidence was literally a splinter lodged in his skull. Death was so undignified that it actually changed the course of European history. His widow, Catherine de' Medici, to take control of France because the succession was disputed. She wasn't supposed to have any real power at all. But one stupid accident, one moment where a piece of wood went the wrong way, shifted the balance of an entire continent. And here's what's even darker. Catherine had power. She kept it by doing things that were far worse than anything her husband ever did. She orchestrated the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of religious minorities were slaughtered. She poisoned rivals. She manipulated marriages and alliances to consolidate control, all because one jousting accident created a power vacuum that she was positioned to. So, the embarrassing deaths matter not because they're funny, though some of them definitely are, but because they remind us that the entire structure of history is built on luck and accident and contingency. A random piece of wood in the wrong place, a fall from a horse, a sudden illness. Trivial things reshape empires and change the lives of millions, which means every ruler who ever lived was terrified of one specific thing. Assassination, not rebellion, not military defeat, but pure random chance. Meaningless accident that could strike at any moment and undo everything they'd built. Let me know if you want more content exploring this specific angle. I've put together a deep analysis in the description that breaks down how random chance has literally redirected the course of human civilization in ways we still don't fully appreciate. Worth checking out if this topic hooks you. Because here's what most people miss. The rulers who survived weren't the smartest or the strongest. They were the ones who got lucky. And that terrifies us because it means we're all just one random moment away from everything changing. Consider King Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg monarch. His family had ruled for 2 centuries through careful bloodline control, a single genetic coin flip, inbreeding that nobody could predict or prevent, left him so deformed he couldn't even chew his own food properly. Jaw was so misshapen that his doctors were stunned he could survive at all. All that power, all that dynasty, undone by nothing more than bad luck in the genetic lottery. He couldn't produce an heir, the line ended, and Spain descended into civil war. Take Emperor Maximilian II of Mexico, who was executed by firing squad in 1867. But that's not the part that matters here. What matters is that he only became emperor because a random series of diplomatic failures forced France to back him as a puppet ruler. Was never supposed to be there. He was never meant to hold that crown. Random chance put him in a position where his only exit was a bullet. He wrote his final letters knowing that if history had unfolded just slightly differently, if one ambassador had made a different decision, one letter had arrived a day sooner, he'd have lived out his life in obscurity instead of facing a firing squad at dawn. Is the secret that historians don't like to talk about. We want to believe in grand narratives that power flows from intelligence, virtue, or strength. We want to believe that history makes sense. But the truth is far darker. Most of history was shaped by people who were in the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the wrong time, completely by accident. About Napoleon. His rise to power was contingent on about 15 different random events. If the French Revolution had started 1 year later, crop failures hadn't created hunger, if a specific general hadn't died at a specific moment leaving a power vacuum, Napoleon never becomes emperor. Dies an obscure artillery officer whose name nobody remembers. But because the dice landed exactly right, he reshaped the entire European continent. And here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. We're not that different from them. Every single person watching this video exists because of 1,000 random moments. Your parents met by chance. Grandparents survived when they probably shouldn't have. One generation back, all it would have taken is one different decision, one moment of bad luck, and you wouldn't exist. The entire lineage that produced you could have ended at any point. We inherited the world from people who survived on pure accident, and the systems they built, governments, laws, currencies, religions, are all maintained by people who are also just one random event away from everything collapsing. A virus that nobody predicted, a meteor strike, a leader's sudden stroke, a bridge that wasn't inspected carefully enough. These aren't dramatic narratives. They're not stories we tell in heroic terms. But they're the actual forces that have repeatedly redirected human civilization. The rulers who understood this truly understood it, not just intellectually but emotionally. They were the ones who developed paranoia. They weren't paranoid because they were weak or insecure. They were paranoid because they grasped a fundamental truth about existence. All their power was temporary, that all their control was an illusion, and that death could come from literally anywhere. So they surrounded themselves with tasters, with guards, with astrologers, trying to read the future in the stars. Not because they were foolish, because they understood something we've mostly forgotten in our modern world of safety nets and insurance policies. The deepest irony is this: the more power a ruler accumulated, the more they had to lose, and therefore the more they had to fear. A peasant living in a cottage could lose everything and still have nothing to lose, but a king had built a monument to himself. Bigger the monument, the harder it could fall, and every king knew it. This is why so many rulers became religious, because they were faithful men. Many of them were monsters who had committed atrocities, but because religion offered them a kind of narrative, comfort. If a god was in control, then they weren't truly responsible for the random moments that happened to them. There was a plan, was a reason. The meaninglessness was transformed into divine will, but we don't get that comfort anymore. Modern rulers, politicians, billionaires, celebrities, they live in the same random universe, but without the religious framework that made it psychologically bearable. Can't blame a god. They can't claim divine will. So what do they do instead? They build bunkers. They buy private armies. Try to control everything through surveillance and prediction. But it's all an attempt to fight something that can't be fought. Fundamental randomness of existence. The scholars and historians who study power often miss this entirely. Talk about policies and strategy and the great men who shaped history, but the real story is simpler and far more terrifying. History was shaped by whoever happened to be alive at the moment when random chance created an opening. Everyone, from peasant to king, is playing a game where the rules are written by probability, not by intelligence or virtue or strength. If you want to understand this concept more deeply, how randomness has literally rewritten human history dozens of times over, how we can trace the exact moments where pure chance altered the course of civilizations, I've put together a full resource in the description and comment that goes way deeper into the mathematics and philosophy behind this. It's genuinely eye-opening stuff. I'd recommend checking it out if this idea resonates with you. So where does this leave us? If history is fundamentally shaped by randomness, all power is temporary. If every ruler eventually faces a moment they can't control, what's the point? Why do we keep building, creating, trying to leave a mark? Maybe that's the only sane response to this truth. Not to pretend that our legacy will endure forever. Not to believe that our power is real or permanent, but to build anyway, knowing it will all eventually fall. To create knowing it will all eventually be destroyed. To rule knowing you will eventually lose everything. To find meaning not in the permanence of what you build, but in the act of building itself. Because the tyrants and the kings never understood this. They built monuments to themselves, thinking they'd endure forever. Accumulated power, thinking it would protect them. They lived in terror of the randomness they couldn't control. They never got to experience what we can experience, the freedom that comes from accepting impermanence. The rulers are gone. Thrones have crumbled. Their empires have turned to dust. And somehow we're still here. We're still building, still creating, still surviving. We're doing it with the knowledge that it will all eventually fall. Maybe that makes us wiser than any king who ever lived. So the next time you read about a ruler who died in some bizarre, unexpected way, remember that this wasn't an anomaly. This was the rule, was how history actually works. And this was the terror that every person who ever held power had to live with, knowing that random chance was always waiting in the shadows. I want to say a genuine thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video. It a lot that you'd spend this time with me exploring the darkest corners of history. If this perspective on power and randomness fascinated you, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss when we upload new horrors every single week. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the truths that textbooks deliberately